every day to people's backyards during lunch, dinner. We send Tylenol in the afternoons, diapers in the evening, just servicing whatever people need in their homes.
I'm Bianca Noblo in London, and this is CNN. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Amanpour. Here's what's coming up.
Now, justice has been delivered, and this terrorist leader is no more.
Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri is killed by a U.S. drone strike. I'm joined by retired Admiral William McRaven, the man who led the raid on Osama bin Laden, on the planning, the precision, and the execution. Then,
it's really important that this agreement is implemented. It's really important that we watch it very closely.
The world watches as Ukraine's grain shipment makes its key city. My conversation with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Bridget Brink. Plus,
I think the chances that we'll have a recession within 18 months or 2 years are 3 and 4.
A stark warning from former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. He looks into his crystal ball in conversation with our Walter Isaacson.
Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Bianca Golodriga in New York, sitting in for Christiane Amanpour. New details are emerging about the U.S. attack that killed al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. According to a senior administration official, the drone strike took President Biden and his inner circle months to secretly plan. Staffers building a small-scale model of Zawahiri's Kabul safe house to help the president decide when to give the order. Zawahiri rose from the Egyptian middle class to become one of America's most wanted terrorists. Michael Holmes explains how he did it.
We want to speak to the whole world. Who are we? Who are we?
By the time Ayman al-Zawahiri burst onto the world scene after the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, he was already a terrorist, committed to turning Egypt into a fundamentalist Islamic state. The young doctor came from one of Egypt's leading families. There is even an al-Zawahiri street in Cairo named after his grandfather. His uncle described him as pious.
He was known that he is a good Muslim who is keen to pray at time in the mosque and to read and to think and to have his own decisions.
Al-Zawahiri spent 3 years in prison after Sadat's assassination. After he got out, he made his way to Pakistan, where he used his medical skills to treat those fighting the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. That's where he met Osama bin Laden, and they found a common cause. He talked about it a decade later.
We are working with Brother bin Laden. We know him since more than 10 years. We have fought with him here in Afghanistan, and we are working with him in Sudan and in many other places.
Al-Zawahiri was many places in the early 1990s, even, it's believed, visiting California on a false passport. His group attacked Egyptian embassies and tried to kill Egyptian politicians. Eventually, Al-Zawahiri folded his group into Al-Qaeda.
Zawahiri pretty much led the group. He did the strategic policy of what Al-Qaeda's agenda was. Certainly bin Laden gave his authority and blessings to it, but al-Zawahiri called the shots.
Al-Zawahiri was at bin Laden's side when he declared war on America in May 1998. Weeks later, they launched an attack on U.S. embassies in Africa, and then gloated after they escaped a U.S. cruise missile attack launched in retaliation. After the 9/11 attacks, al-Zawahiri began to become the voice of al-Qaeda, taunting the U.S.
American people, you must ask yourselves, why all this hate against America?
After the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, bin Laden and al-Zawahiri were on the run, sometimes together, more often apart. His wife and daughters were killed in a U.S. airstrike aimed at him. But he continued to issue messages on subjects ranging from the war in Iraq to the London subway attacks in 2005. And while he was always the likely choice to succeed Osama bin Laden, it took the organisation several weeks to announce his promotion.
Zawahiri is not charismatic. He was not involved in the fight earlier on in Afghanistan. And I think he has a lot of detractors within the organization. And I think you're going to see them start eating themselves from within more and more.
Without bin Laden, Al-Qaeda can never be the same.
It's an idea personified by Osama bin Laden. He was this charismatic figure. To join Al-Qaeda, you pledged a personal oath to him. People went and died, not for Ayman Zawahiri or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but for Osama bin Laden.
Terror experts say that to jihadists worldwide, Al-Qaeda still has great appeal as an inspiration. And while al-Zawahiri was an obvious successor to bin Laden, it's not at all clear who would succeed al-Zawahiri.
Our thanks to Michael Holmes for that report. And joining me now for more on this is retired Admiral William McRaven, the former commander for U.S. Special Operations Command. He oversaw and organized the U.S. operation that killed Osama bin Laden in 2011. And he joins me now from Austin, Texas. Admiral, thank you so much for joining us. First, let me just get your reaction to the news and its significance.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bianna. Obviously, it is really a terrific day for, not just the United States, but frankly for the world. Zawahiri was the head of Al-Qaeda. And while, as in your previous segment, he may not have been as charismatic as bin Laden, make no mistake about it. He was the head. He was planning and orchestrating operations. So taking out the head of Al-Qaeda is a tremendous success. And I think all the credit really goes to the intelligence community that has just done a magnificent job in finding him and eliminating him.
Al-Zawahiri was clearly a top target for the U.S. In addition to bin Laden. Shortly after the successful raid on bin Laden's compound in 2011, you in fact were asked during congressional testimony your thoughts on where al-Zawahiri should be held once he was captured. So my question is, what surprises you more, the fact that it took another 11 years to find him, or that he was found in Kabul, Afghanistan, of all places?
Yeah, I'm not surprised it took so long to find him. I mean, our estimation was that he was hiding somewhere in Pakistan, probably in the federally administered tribal areas, probably with the support of the Haqqani network or the Taliban working out of Pakistan. So it's fairly easy to hide in a country as large as Pakistan. I was surprised that he was in Kabul. I mean, it's a pretty risky move on his part to move from Pakistan, if that's where he was, into Kabul. But obviously he felt safe enough with the protection of the Taliban and again, possibly the Haqqanis that he was going to be safe in Kabul. Obviously not the case.
Yeah, he was killed in an upscale Kabul neighborhood, and apparently the U.S. had been following him and his repeated morning ritual of going out to his third-floor balcony. But he was within walking distance from the former U.S. Embassy complex, which has surprised a lot of experts who've been following this so closely, because it's once again a violation of the Doha Agreement between the Taliban and the United States, and that is that the Taliban would not support and would not help protect al-Qaeda members. This is a gross violation, obviously. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said this morning that, quote, "We have already been engaged with the Taliban, though he would not preview any actions that the U.S. would take in response to this violation." What should the U.S. response look like, in your view?
Yeah, well, we shouldn't be surprised that the Taliban have rolled up and thrown away the Doha Agreement. That shouldn't surprise anyone. I think at the end of the day, this is about making sure that we don't allow Afghanistan to become a sanctuary again. And I think what the U.S. has shown is that we can, in fact, do over-the-horizon targeting on certain high-value individuals. Now, does that mean that, small cells operating in Kabul or out in the rural areas can be found and eliminated? No, that's going to be more challenging. But when you have a high-value individual like an al-Zawahiri or whoever his predecessor will be, I think we're in a reasonably good position to continue to be able to identify these folks and eliminate them, frankly, wherever they go.
It's interesting because this mission comes as we approach 1 year of President Biden withdrawing U.S. troops from Afghanistan. And President Biden said at the time that these over-the-horizon missions would continue in terms of counterterrorism operations. You, interestingly enough, at the time of the U.S. withdrawal, also said that you had hope and faith in these over-the-horizon missions with unmanned drones. That having been said, you alluded to this earlier, how concerned are you that it's just taken a year for somebody of his caliber to come back and feel safe in Afghanistan? And what does that say about the country, again, being a safe haven for terrorists potentially plotting another attack against the United States?
Well, I think what we have to realize is that al-Qaeda can probably find sanctuary in a lot of different places. Afghanistan, certainly with the support of Taliban, but there are places in in West Africa and East Africa and places around the world where they could, in fact, find sanctuary. It is our responsibility as the U.S. and within the broader intelligence community to try to develop the sources, to identify where the threats might be coming from, and then, again, if necessary, working with our allies or working by ourselves to, find where these threats are and eliminate them. And again, that is exactly what the intelligence community did in the case of Zawahiri.
Let's talk about how this was all conducted, because in some ways it's very similar to how the bin Laden raid was organized and the months that went into planning for it. There are similarities here. The U.S. intel had eyes on al-Zawahiri for months, I believe since the beginning of the year, had solid evidence ultimately that was him. And they were planning this mission by building a small-scale model of Zawahiri's safe house constructed by U.S. intelligence. Now, with your operation, obviously that was manned. It did include a SEAL team and troops on the ground there. But talk about the similarities that you find between these two missions, just in terms of the preparation for it.
Yeah, I think you find a lot of similarities between the intelligence buildup and, to your point, beyond the preparation. So the intelligence on these high-value individuals generally begins with a source. Somebody that has come forward through our intelligence network that says, I think I know where Zawahiri is. Now, you have to vet that source. You've got to determine whether or not that's a reliable source. And then if the source gives you indications and warnings about where Zawahiri might be, then obviously you're going to slew all of your intelligence resources, your overhead intelligence, your signals and technical intelligence, your human intelligence, if you have it, to be able to kind of triangulate to ascertain whether or not the source is in fact correct about the location of this high-value individual. Clearly what happened here was the source, assuming it was a source, led the intelligence community to this house in Kabul, and then you really begin to have to develop this kind of pattern of life. Now, in the case of bin Laden, of course, we could never really determine with 100% assurity that it was, in fact, bin Laden in the Abbottabad compound. I think with this compound in Kabul, because they were able to establish a proof of life and a pattern of life and identify that it was, in fact, Zawahiri who kind of came to the window routinely, that they were a lot more confident in this target. But once again, the preparation from the intelligence community that went into this had to be phenomenal. And building the model is always great when you are briefing senior officials like the President of the United States, because they can look at it and they can kind of turn it around from angle to angle. The targeteers are going to talk to them about, hey, here's exactly how the Hellfire missiles are going to hit. Here's what the potential collateral damage will be or not be. And models are very helpful. So in that regard, there's a lot of similarities with the bin Laden raid, again, in the intelligence gathering and in the build up to the strike.
And the ingenuity, right, and technology has increased substantially since then, and the fact that you can have a missile without a warhead at this point that just has switchblades on it to know that there will not be a lot of collateral. Apparently, no one else in his family in that house was injured or killed other than him. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on President Biden's take on this, because at the time of the bin Laden raid, he was vice president then, and he was one of the few who advised President Obama to not go through with that raid. I'm interested to get your thoughts on his change of thought in how he approached approving this mission.
Well, again, the operational aspects of this mission versus the bin Laden raid are fundamentally different. Again, the intelligence preparation are very similar. The preparation and briefing, the president, are very similar, but the actual operation fundamentally different. And so I think, you know, and again, I don't want to speak for President Biden, but my guess is, as he looked at the bin Laden raid and said, well, we're going to send a bunch of SEALs in a couple of helicopters 160 miles into Abbottabad in a compound that's about 3 miles from their West Point, 3 miles from a major infantry battalion, a mile from a police station. Oh, by the way, you know, the Pakistanis have nuclear weapons. I mean, all of this kind of comes into play. And so when you make a risk assessment of the fact that we could send U.S. troops into Pakistan, and if things go south, you know, you're going to have more casualties. In the case of the strike in Kabul, they had the advantage of probably, one, knowing for certain that it was Ayman al-Zawahiri. Two, they had the munitions, which, again, we didn't have at the time in 2011, but they have the munitions now that can be very precise so that you're not going to have any collateral damage, and then you're not putting U.S. boots on the ground. So all of those, I think, portend to the reason the president made the decision this time with Zawahiri and probably not with bin Laden.
Another similarity is that in terms of confirming proof of life, in both cases, that was not done with DNA. And that is what we heard from National Security spokesman John Kirby, Admiral Kirby, today in saying that they were confident that that was al-Zawahiri, but not through DNA. And I'm just wondering if you can recount for our viewers the similar experience that turned out to be a bit comical in the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden, when after being given multi-million-dollar budget, there was something that was missing from that, and that was a $10 measuring tape. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, one, we did have DNA on bin Laden, so I want to be clear about that.
Okay.
After the remains were brought back, we, in fact, did a lot of DNA gathering.
But at the time, yes, of course.
But at the time, right. So at the time, when bin Laden's remains came in to our facility there in Afghanistan, into the hangar, I was in my little makeshift command center. The President Obama had asked me, you know, did I know for certain whether it was bin Laden? I said, no, sir, I need to go visibly, you know, I need to check the remains before I come back and tell the President of the United States that this is Osama bin Laden. The airfield was just a few minutes from my little makeshift command center. So I went over there, and the SEALs had just brought in the body bag with bin Laden's remains. And without getting too graphic, you know, when I unzipped the body bag, he obviously didn't look terrific after taking a few rounds. But you know, the one thing I knew is that bin Laden was about 6'4", and I'm 6'2". And I thought, well, maybe what I ought to do is you know, lie down next to the remains just to make sure the remains are a little bit longer. But in fact, I had some young SEAL come by and do the lie down next to the remains. And of course, the body was a couple inches longer. When I went back to explain to the president that, look, the photos look like bin Laden, everything was, you know, lining up. And I just kind of made the offhanded comment that, no, by the way, I had a young SEAL lie down next to him, and the remains were a little bit longer. And he said, okay, so let me get this straight. We had $60 million for a helicopter, and you didn't have $10 for a tape measure? And I told folks, I said, look, it was a very serious night with very serious implications. But by this time, the troops were back. We knew the guys were safe. We were, you know, 99% sure at the time before the DNA that it was bin Laden. And it was, you know, candidly, it was a great comment at the time to kind of lower the pressure. And it was helpful, I think, as the night wore on, because it had been a long couple of days.
Give you something at least to laugh about, right, after all that you went through. Before you leave, let me just get you to respond to another major headline that's been developing over the last few hours. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has landed and making a strong statement in arriving in Taiwan, the first Speaker of the House to visit that island in 25 years. She's scheduled to meet with the Taiwanese president tomorrow morning, obviously in response and in the build-up to this possible visit. There had been a lot of heated rhetoric coming out of the Chinese spokespeople and the government themselves, and now they've said that they've announced military drills that are expected to take place around the island in the days to come. There had been reports that there had been some cyber attacks in the president's office. That all having been said, I guess my question to you is, from a cost-benefit analysis, was this trip worth it? And is this trip worth it, in your opinion, for the overall security, I guess, for the island?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I would want to voice my opinion on whether or not it was appropriate for Speaker Pelosi to go to Taiwan. Well, what I would say, Bianna, is, look, at the end of the day, we do not want to make the Chinese our opponents. They are going to be competitors. We understand that. Nothing wrong with good, healthy competition, but I think we're in a position now to figure out how do we lower the heat a little bit. We want to build relationships with China that don't put us in an adversarial position, that don't put us in conflict in the South China Sea, that don't put us in conflict in Taiwan. So I think the diplomatic approach is probably a better approach to take than to some degree, initiating something that really, in my opinion, probably doesn't advance the cause of building relationships with China that, again, we understand all the issues that are problematic with China, but the role of the State Department and to some degree the role of the military should be to build this relationship and not exacerbate it.
Admiral William McRaven, so wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much for taking the time. And once again, as always, thank you for your service. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Bianna.
Well, Speaker Pelosi's controversial trip to Taiwan is further roiling U.S.-China tensions. And Beijing has been piling on the rhetoric today, warning that the U.S. will pay the price if it dares to undermine Chinese sovereignty. Take a listen to what the Chinese ambassador to Washington said today.
China has every right to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. We are fully justified to do what we must. The current situation is created purely by the U.S. side. So, of course, it has to bear the responsibilities.
The White House says this trip does not signify a change in America's one China policy. In an op-ed for the Washington Post, the speaker herself called the visit an unequivocal statement that America stands with Taiwan. Meantime, Moscow is also weighing in, saying Russia stands with China. Hardly a surprise stance from President Putin as the war in Ukraine escalates. The U.S. announced an additional $550 million security assistance package for Ukraine at the start of the week, and it is much needed. While the Ukrainian military says that it is repelling Russian attacks in the east, there's pain in the south, where Mykolaiv is getting pounded by Russian artillery. The city's mayor describing the recent assaults as the strongest shelling since the start of the war. And there's perhaps one bright spot in all of this. A Ukrainian shipment of grain is reaching Istanbul today, where it will be checked before moving on to Lebanon. It's the first such delivery since the Russian invasion began. Earlier, I spoke about all of this with Bridget Brink, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Here's our conversation. Ambassador Brink, thank you so much for joining the program. Let me begin by asking you about the latest Russian assault against the southern port city of Mykolaiv over the weekend. There seems to be a pattern here. This follows an assault on the port city of Odessa. The week prior to that, Russia claims that they were targeting military infrastructure. But in the crosshairs, there are schools that were damaged. Civilians were killed. There was a sports center damaged as well. Is it the U.S. view that Russia is purposefully targeting civilians, specifically by launching these targeted attacks on the weekend?
Bianna, thanks so much for having me. What I can say is Russia's actions in Ukraine are unconscionable. We are working here night and day to try to help Ukraine defend itself from what is an unprovoked, unjustified attack by another country. And we're going to continue to do that for as long as it takes.
What is your assessment as to the read on the ground there? There was relentless bombardment over the past few months in the east, in the Donetsk region there, and Luhansk as well, but the Donbass region as a whole, with a lot of inroads made by Russia. But as of late, military analysts say Russia hasn't captured any new territory since July. There's been an influx of U.S. military equipment, specifically the HIMARS, which have significantly upped the ante for Russia there. And they are now on the receiving end of attacks from Ukraine. What is your take about Ukraine's position now in trying to reclaim some of that territory?
Well, thanks for that. Yes, there continues to be fighting in the Donbass in the eastern part of the country, but it is clear that the weaponry that we have been able to provide, including the HIMARS, have had an effect. So since June 1st, we have provided some $4 billion in assistance. There just was another announcement yesterday, $550 million, which included HIMAR ammunition and other types of ammunition. So it's absolutely clear that, as Secretary Austin said in June, we're going to push harder, move faster. That's exactly what we have done, and we can see that that has had a battlefield impact for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, you mentioned that new tranche of $550 million in military support. The total, I believe, is about $8.7 billion from the Biden administration alone. The level of equipment and weaponry has increased significantly over the course of this war. There had been reports that the U.S. was even considering sending F-16 planes. Obviously, this is something that the Ukraine had been asking for. President Zelensky had been hoping for months now. What is the status of that request?
Well, what I can say is that we, and especially our militaries, are in constant communication with our Ukrainian partners. Just yesterday, I had the chance to meet with the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, where we talked about assistance and our assistance going forward. Also yesterday, there were phone calls between DC and Kyiv with the folks that are leading on defense issues and leading the battle on the ground. And so I can say that every single day, even more than one time a day, even sometimes hourly, we are communicating with our Ukrainian partners to try to figure out how we can best support their needs on the ground.
As Ukraine is trying to claw back on this counteroffensive to regain hold of cities in the south there, Kherson, Zaporizhia, those are two large cities there that had been captured by the Russians. Moscow-backed local officials in the area are suggesting that they are going to be holding referendums in the coming months. Obviously, this is not something that would be legitimately recognized by the West or Ukraine. But given that, how much more difficult would these referendums make any sort of attempt to negotiate this land back into the hands of Ukrainians?
Well, I think, as Secretary of State Blinken said recently, we have downgraded intelligence, which also corroborates those reports that we have heard about Russia's active annexation that is happening right now, and also intention to take steps such as hold sham referenda in those places where Russia is currently occupying Ukrainian territory. We've seen this before. It's a playbook from 2014 when Russia did the same thing in Crimea, and we have been very clear that this is something that would have continued consequences from us and also from the rest of the international community.
What kind of consequences? Because unfortunately, the sham referendum seemed to work. Russia still controls Crimea. And I guess the concern would be that if these referendums go through and Russia claims these territories as Russian with Russian citizens using Russian currency, the likelihood of Ukraine being able to reclaim that would be slim to none.
Well, I think that also, from my perspective, one of the main tools that we do have is imposing costs on Russia. And we've done this in a number of ways. Number one, with an unprecedented set of sanctions with partners from around the world that are imposing very serious economic costs on Russia that will only grow over time. Number two, we have reinforced NATO's eastern flank, and obviously there are big changes happening in NATO with Sweden and Finland also on the cusp of becoming members as well, which is definitely changing the security dynamic in a way that is not what Putin said he wanted. And number three, we are, together with partners and allies around the world, arming and supporting Ukraine. So yes, there will be consequences, and these will continue to play out over time.
We mentioned that the increased fighting in the east and the Donbas region of the country. Ukraine currently controls about 40% of Donbas. And as we speak, President Zelensky has ordered the evacuation of those Ukrainians that live there from the region. He made that call Saturday night and said that his main concern was not only for their physical safety today, but in the future in terms of their gas supply. Now, gas supply from Russia has ended in 2015. Ukraine has not been on the receiving end from Russia for their gas since then. They have been getting gas from Western partners. But I'm just curious as a whole, given the concern about the limited amount of gas and the withholding of gas from Russia to Western Europe, how much concern is there in Ukraine right now about the future and stability of gas for the country as a whole as the winter months approach?
Well, I think it's probably a concern for all of Europe. I know that we and the Europeans agree that it's very important to remove this dependency on Russian energy for Europe. And as you said, Ukraine is not now dependent on energy supply from Russia. It's important that we see that happen more broadly, and we are working together with the Europeans to do what we can to support that goal.
In terms of you continue to talk about the cost imposed from the West on Russia, and that comes in the form of sanctions. Obviously, Russia has taken a hit and has been ostracized from the world and its assets frozen. That having been said, they continue to profit from the premium that we've seen in the rise in oil and gas prices. At the same time, Ukraine's economy continues to suffer. If Russia's is expected to shrink, their GDP expected to shrink about 10% this year, Ukraine's is expected to decline by 40%. So from that perspective alone, is at least in the short term, Russia having the upper hand here? Is Russia winning on the economic front?
I don't think Russia has the upper hand by any means. I think that everything that Putin set out to achieve, the reverse has happened. His economy has been hard hit, and it will continue to be hit as these sanctions continue to take effect. For the Ukrainians, we and the European Union are providing direct budget support, and we will be providing something in the order of 4.5 billion more by the end of September. So we will continue to support the Ukrainians together with partners and allies on the economic front as well as on the security front.
Let me ask you about this latest attack on the Lenivka prison, and that is where some 53 Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed in an attack at a detention camp there in eastern Ukraine. Russians claim that this attack was delivered by the Ukrainians using HIMARS. These are these long-range rockets provided by the United States we just talked about earlier. I'm not sure there's intelligence to back that up, but in light of this attack, President Zelensky has once again asked for the West to designate Russia as a state-sponsored, as a terrorist state. Would the U.S. support that? And if not, why not?
I can say, as the Secretary of State and others have said, we are looking at this very closely. It's based on law, and we have to make sure that whatever steps we take are in accordance with U.S. law. At the same time, we continue to take steps that are the same as what such a designation would require, including steps with regard to sanctions. So effectively, we are doing most, if not all, of what such a designation would require. We are, though, examining it very closely, and once that's finished, we will respond as appropriate.
Can I ask you to weigh in on a new column from New York Times columnist Tom Friedman that has been getting some buzz overnight, where he is claiming that there is, quote, deep mistrust between the White House and President Zelensky, considerably more than has been reported. And he points to unanswered questions about the firing of Ukraine's prosecutor, head of its domestic intelligence, pointing to perhaps more corruption there within the government than has been made known publicly. Is there distrust between the White House and President Zelensky?
Well, I haven't read that particular article, but I certainly wouldn't say that.
So whatever he's describing from his sources, you don't see any of that?
No.
Well, if there's any good news to be had, Ambassador, it is that the first grain shipment has left the port of Odessa since the start of this war, and that was just this week, about 26,000 tons of corn. Obviously, we know 20 million tons of grain had been detained there since February. Another 16 ships are set to sail out as well in the coming weeks. How much trust and faith do you have in light of everything we've just discussed on Russia's end of upholding their bargain and their pledge that these ships will come out and address a lot of the food insecurity we're seeing in this war in the world because of this war?
Well, it's a very good question, Bianna, because a day after the agreement was signed to allow the grain to depart Ukrainian ports, Russia then fired missiles into the port, into Odessa. So it was for that reason that we have been very active in supporting implementation of this agreement. And the G7 ambassadors, together with President Zelensky, traveled to Odessa just last Friday to show support for Ukrainian ships getting out of port. So this did happen yesterday. It's a good step forward, a positive step forward. That ship, I think, is almost to the Bosphorus, if not there already now. And it's the first ship to go. Many more are waiting in line. This ship that just is sailing now has 26,000 metric tons of corn. There are about 20 million tons of wheat and other agricultural products which are waiting in Ukrainian ports to ship out to feed millions of people. It's really important that this agreement is implemented. It's really important that we watch it very closely, and we will continue to do so over the next days, weeks, and months.
Of course, this was a small, just kernel of hope, perhaps, in this war that we are starting to see at least this part of the devastation start to lift in terms of the suffering that many around the world are enduring right now with food insecurity. Let me finally ask you, President Biden has said that he is in it for the long term, that however long this war will be going on, the U.S. will be supporting Ukraine. I'm just curious, we're 4 months in. There doesn't look like there's an end in sight. Russia now controls about 20% of Ukraine. That's, somebody put it, about 3 Estonias. That's a huge part of that country. Where will we be 6 months from now, a year from now, as you look at this war from your perch there in Kyiv representing the United States?
Well, thank you for that question. I can't predict the future. I can say I 100% agree with the president. We are going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We're doing this because it is the morally right thing to do. But we are also doing this because it's in our vital national interests. As you see from the situation with the grain, Russia's war is causing extreme economic instability and price spikes. It is also showing, and the question is how other countries would look at a situation where aggressors can change borders by force or show that might makes right. This is not in the U.S. interests. It's in the U.S. interest to have a stable and secure Europe. And Russia's actions, Russia's attacks on Ukraine are threatening that. So we are in it for as long as it takes.
And yet it appears Vladimir Putin is in it for as long as it takes as well. There had been reports that the tide has turned, in his mind at least, that he believes that Russia can win and perhaps make another stab at taking Kyiv even. And as we see, the indiscriminate attacks are unleashed for those major port cities in the south. Do you yourself feel safe? It's a symbolic move, a big move, to have the United States and the embassy back there on the ground, in the country, in the capital. Do you feel safe, though, as you continue to watch this war unfold?
I would say that's not a question I ask myself. We try to do what we can because I have a team here to make sure that we are safeguarding people such as we can, but the risk is missile attacks. This is the point, is that no country should be able to threaten another country in this way. And people shouldn't have to wake up and wonder if a missile is going to attack them at any moment or hit them in their homes, in their schools, in their communities. This is not something that we can tolerate and support and see happen in Europe once again. So it's another reason why I think we wake up and every day feel that we need to be here and we need to keep supporting Ukraine.
It sends a big message to see that United States flag behind you there at the U.S. Embassy and have a U.S. ambassador in place. Ambassador Brink, thank you for your time. Be safe and best of luck.
Thank you very much.
Well, back in the U.S., voting is expected to begin in the Senate this week on the climate and health care bill known as the Inflation Reduction Act. A group of top economists has penned a letter praising the bill, saying that it will lower prices for American consumers. Our next guest agrees and even helped convince Senator Joe Manchin to support it. Larry Summers was Treasury Secretary under President Clinton and formerly the chief economist at the World Bank. He speaks to Walter Isaacson about how to fight inflation without triggering a recession.
Thank you, Bianna. And Professor Larry Summers, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you.
You turned out to be right about inflation, for better or worse. The stimulus that we did overheated the economy. How necessary and likely do you think it is that we will need a recession to wring this inflation out of our economy?
The experience is you don't bring down inflation from these levels without recession. Soft landings represent the triumph of hope over experience. So I think the chances that we'll have a recession within 18 months or 2 years are 3 and 4, at least. I doubt we're there now, but I do think we will get there if inflation is going to be wrung out of the system. There's another possibility, which is that just as some people sometimes don't take all their antibiotics and stop when they feel better, that we will relent here and create more of a stagflationary dynamic than a recession. But that's postponing the recession, not making it unnecessary. So I think there is turbulence and difficulty ahead. And that's, of course, what's priced into markets, with the expectation that before too long, the Fed's going to be cutting interest rates, with what's happened in cyclical stocks in the stock market. So I think there probably is a recession in our future, unfortunately.
You economists have a formula that tries to gauge how much unemployment is going to have to rise in order to bring down each point of inflation. How much do you think we'll be facing? We have very low unemployment now, but facing higher unemployment.
I think there's enormous uncertainty surrounding a calculation like that, but I'd be surprised if we got inflation durably back to 2%. Without unemployment crossing 6% and perhaps staying above 6% for some time. That's a pretty serious move from where we are on the one hand. On the other hand, it's nowhere near back to the great financial crisis where unemployment crossed 10, or back to the Volcker disinflation where unemployment crossed 10. So I think this is going to be most likely a meaningful recession that's going to involve significant distress, but at the same time, I don't think is going to be a major event in economic and financial history when that event is written.
Yeah, but it could be very difficult for people and politically disruptive. I mean, every 0.1% that unemployment rises, it means there's 150,000 people who aren't going to work that day, 150,000 kids whose parents say they don't have jobs. Is there some way that you could say that perhaps we don't need to get inflation down to 2%? Is it worth living with inflation at 4% if we can keep unemployment down?
Walter, look, you're absolutely right about how terrible unemployment is. I wrote on my essays when I was saying I wanted to go become an economist, that I thought that the most important thing I could do in my life was think about how to reduce that risk of unemployment. So you're absolutely right. On the other hand, I think you have to think very carefully, not just about short-run pain, but about the longer term. And the risk is that if you start accepting higher rates of inflation, it's a slippery slope. And then you end up having to have an even bigger recession in the future. The kind of thing I just heard you saying is the kind of thing that was said all the time by progressives during the 1970s and set the stage for Ronald Reagan's election and the Great Recession that followed. So Do we need to be religious about 2.0? No, we do not need to be religious about 2.0. Was the Fed making a mistake when it set a specific numerical target rather than doing what an earlier era of Feds had done and talked about price stability in a more general way? I would have stuck with the idea of price stability. But can we just sort of squirm out of this without accepting any pain? I think that's a dangerous and problematic course, not because I care about financial shibboleths, but because I care about unemployment today and I care about unemployment in the future. It's why I'm glad that Jay Powell renounced the idea of forward guidance and making a whole set of prior commitments in favor of the idea of making the best judgments they could as things go.
You were involved in talking to Senator Manchin and others about why this new reconciliation bill called an Inflation Reduction Bill would actually reduce inflation. Give me the arguments, and it's not by raising unemployment. You think it will reduce inflation how?
Three ways, and I think it's a very good and important bill. It reduces demand because we raise taxes more than we increase spending, thereby reducing deficits. It increases supply by stimulating energy infrastructure and stimulating and subsidizing and supporting renewables. And it uses purchasing power of the government in the pharmaceutical sector to bring down pharmaceutical prices and to reduce consumers' health insurance costs. So better bargaining, more supply, less demand. That means less price growth, and that ultimately means less inflation and takes some of the burden off the Fed.
You say that this bill will bring inflation down, and it does so in ways that doesn't seem to add to unemployment. Are there other things we can do to reduce inflation like this, whether it be lowering tariffs and other things that might help us fight inflation without pushing us into a recession or higher unemployment?
Walter, I think one has to be honest and say that the primary burden rests with monetary policy, and that rests with demand. But I'd like to see us reduce tariffs in a meaningful way. I'd like to see us put more effort at supporting low-cost purchasing. For example, the Jones Act says that you can't ship oil from Texas to Newark except on an American carrier. That raises prices. We have rules that say that British Airways can't fly me from Boston to San Francisco. That reduces competition and increases prices. We have rules on procurement by the federal government that both hugely slow down infrastructure projects and often make them cost much more than they should. I saw a statistic that the New York subway was costing 5 times as much per mile as the French subway, and France isn't known as a country that doesn't respect labor rights or a country that does things in maximally inexpensive ways. So I think there are a variety of things we could look at in terms of affordability economics that would be constructive. But again, I think the primary responsibility has to rest with demand management policy.
One of the things that Senator Manchin pushed for that you've just talked about is allowing infrastructure and allowing, for that matter, both clean energy and pipelines and others to be permitted more rapidly. How much of is that just something that would be a little bit of easier for producers, or is that something that can really affect the economy if we started building infrastructure in ways that didn't require so much permitting and red tape?
It adds up. It adds up with respect to energy. Look, it is insane that we are, as a country on a large scale, shipping petroleum products in trucks that have tanks attached to them. It's bad for the environment. It raises the risk of major accidents. It's much more expensive. It's absurd how hard it is to build a pipeline in the United States. So yes, I think Senator Manchin is right about that. I think it's true in many areas. I've been flying from Boston to Washington for all kinds of reasons for 40 years now. It used to take an hour and a quarter. Now it takes an hour and 45 minutes. It's not because the planes have gotten slower. It's not because the airports are in different places. It's all because of lagging and inadequate infrastructure. And that is something that should be fixed.
What fundamental changes, if any, have happened to the U.S. labor market through everything from COVID to what's called the Great Resignation? Are we in a place where the number of vacancies isn't as correlated to unemployment, or has the job market changed significantly?
I think the Great Resignation has shaken things up. And so when things are all shook up, you get more unemployment and you get more vacancies at the same time. And by the way, that's a lot of the reason why wages are going up so fast, adding to inflation pressure. And I think that's just something we're gonna have to recognize over time. That's a process that is likely to readjust. We've got to try to do things to make it easy for seniors who want to stay in the labor force to stay at work. I think we need to be thinking much more creatively than we have traditionally about second careers for people. I think there are big opportunities to add to our labor force by helping mothers who have stayed out of the workforce for years while their kids are growing up to get back into the workforce. I think if we can change zoning rules and NIMBY in a variety of places, we can make it easier for people to get to the places where jobs are. And I think all of that will both make our economy function better and tend to bring down the rate of inflation. And I have to say that while the problems and the challenges are immense, the fact that in the last couple of months, last month really, President Biden has been able to move forward the semiconductor legislation that at last is going to move towards insulating us from being totally dependent on some of the world's most dangerous places for semiconductors. The fact that we're taking the necessary steps on healthcare costs, making the biggest investments in clean energy that any country has ever made. I think that those things aren't the end. They're probably not even the beginning of the end. But as Churchill famously said during World War II, I think they are the end of the beginning with respect to undertaking some quite broad structural reforms in our country.
If we're going to improve our economy and if we're going to be pushing back on Russia and other things, do you think it makes sense to have a better relationship with China? And how can we go about that?
Look, Walter, I think we need to recognize that the China we knew a decade ago is not Xi Jinping's China. It's not Xi Jinping's China in terms of what they're doing militarily. It's not Xi Jinping's China. And it's not the China we knew in terms of a gradual trend towards opening up. It's not the China we knew in terms of industrial espionage practices. It's not the China we knew in terms of collaborating with other countries. So we can't have any kind of romantic illusion. I think we need to try to practice what might be called strategic empathy and understand how the world looks from their perspective, as well as simply insisting on how it looks from our perspective. So I think that that's the balance that we need to strike, and it's an enormously challenging and difficult balance to strike. I think our errors over the last 18 months have all been on the side of being more truculent than might have been necessary. But at the same time, I don't think we should be viewing China with any illusion that it is a entirely benign force in the world.
Professor Larry Summers, thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you, Walter. Thank you.
Some really interesting perspective there on China from Larry Summers in light of all the news this week. And finally, even she couldn't believe it, an unexpected gold medal for cyclist Laura Kenny. The English superstar dominated in a stunning performance at the Commonwealth Games on Monday.